In this video, I'm going to show you how to solve a common issue we face with layouts in the Android operating system because layouts don't have a lot of room. So how do we show a calendar so that a user can pick a date? If we take a look at just putting in a text box, the trick is how's the user going to enter a date there? Will they say December or will they do some kind of abbreviation? So what I'm going to show, instead of showing a text box, I'm going to replace this with a button, and that button is going to bring up a date dialog with a calendar where a user can pick a date from that calendar, and then the date that the user chose will appear as the text on the button that we're going to put in this space right here where my mouse is pointing. So the steps that we need. First of all, we need to create a button and put it in that location so that it can invoke the date picker. Next, we need an interface so that we can create a callback. In other words, we're going to send something up to this date picker so that when the user picks a date, it will come back and inform us in our local fragment or activity. And for that, the fragment or activity that we're in is going to need to implement this interface and therefore implement this callback method. Then we're going to create a class called DatePickerFragment that's going to extend DialogFragment, and it's going to interact with something called DatePickerDialog, which will show the calendar. Next, we'll instantiate the DatePickerFragment from whatever activity or fragment we are in. We'll pass the callback interface in, and then we'll show it. Then the user will pick the date, and then we will update the button with that date. So let's do this hands-on one at a time. We will start with the button that we want to choose. If we take a look at what I have over here in Design View, it is essentially this same screen right here. Now, one trick is that I've already created the screen in a series of previous videos, and I'm using constraint layout. Constraint layout is a little bit tricky when you want to remove something and add something new, at least in Design View. It's easier to do in the Code View, where we can take a look at the XML. Secondly, we're going to use a traditional button. I usually prefer an image button because in Android, pictures are faster than words, and pictures don't have to be translated. But in this case, I'm going to use a more traditional button that will show text because I want to show the date on that button. So let's go into our code view and take a look at the text that we want to change. You see it's edit text txt date planted. I'm simply going to change this to button. Then to kind of fix my abbreviation, instead of txt date planted, I'll call it btn date planted. Now, one trick is that's going to set off the component below it because this is a constraint layout. Everything is relative to each other. So you see this next linear layout that follows, it starts to redline because I have changed the name of this component from txt date planted to btn date planted. Easy enough. I just need to change it universally, and then we're in good shape. Now, hint is not so relevant here because hint is the label that we'll see in a text component before the user types in it, but this is not something the user will type in. So let's change this to text. So that's what the user will actually see on the button. Now, because I was already using that text component elsewhere, I'm going to clean up a few other instances of the old name and change it to the new. Anytime I make a change to a layout, especially a constraint layout, I like to go ahead and run it in the debugger and just make sure it looks okay. So this is where we used to have a text field. You see now it has a button. I press it and nothing happens just yet. So we're ready to move on to step 2. Normally, if I already knew all of these steps, I would move on to this create interface. But at this point, that's just going to confuse things a little bit. So actually, I'm going to hold that step for a little bit until we've had time to work through these next 2 steps. So right now, let's focus on create class DatePickerFragment that extends DialogFragment. This will be a new class, so I could right-click and say new and then Kotlin file class and then call DatePickerFragment right here. I have another option though. This is all going to be coordinated by main fragment, so I could also make it an inner class of main fragment. That's not a bad idea if you only have maybe one fragment or this is only going to be used in one fragment. If you're going to use it in multiple fragments, go ahead and put it as a separate class. Nonetheless, let's see, the companion object we usually put towards the bottom, so I'll leave that there. And then here I'm going to say inner class DatePickerFragment, and then the colon extends DialogFragment, Alt-Enter, and import DialogFragment. That gives me an option here to override a function on onCreateDialog. We'll come back to this in just a moment, but this is a function that I'm going to do a lot with. One other thing that I want to do, DialogFragment is just a generic fragment, but for this one, I actually want it to be a date picker. So I'm going to add an interface. DatePickerDialog.onDateSetListener. Now remember that an interface is essentially a collection of method signatures, and that's a contract. If you implement an interface, you have to provide an implementation for all of those method signatures one way or another. You can leave it empty or you can have a subclass implement it, but by contract, you have to implement all of them. So notice that as soon as I added that interface, I got a red line on my class, and why is that? Well, Alt-Enter, implement members, and take a look. It gives me a new function signature called onDateSet. This will be invoked when the user picks a date from this fragment that we're creating. So next step then is this little sub-bullet point. Because we've created this onCreateDialog function, we can now return a new DatePickerDialog from that function. It's a little tricky thing here. We don't need the super call because we're going to handle this dialog ourselves. So we'll say return DatePickerDialog, and notice it gives me a red line. And when I hold Alt and press Enter, it thinks I'm trying to call a function called DatePickerDialog, but actually I'm trying to construct an object, and that object requires a very specific signature. I'm going to put a couple things in here as a placeholder, and then we'll refactor it and we'll make it look as we want. And this is one of the classes that we're importing. It's an API class or one of the library classes. So this is a fairly standard constructor signature that I'm going to use. First, we need to pass to it a context, which represents our application. Next, I'm going to pass in a DatePickerDialog on DateSetListener. Now, what is that? Well, that actually counts as the current class that we're in, because notice that we're implementing this interface called DatePickerDialog.onDateSetListener. In other words, we're passing in what we want this DatePickerDialog to call back when the user picks a date. And when the user picks a date, we want it to call back to this function right here called onDateSet. So we need to pass in a reference to the current object. After that, let me pass in 3 numbers, and this is what I'm going to refactor in a moment. I just want to show that by passing in these 5 items, the red line goes away and this now compiles. So the context, who are we? The callback, which is a reference to this function right here. And then you notice year, month, day of month. So it's saying, okay, how do you want to initialize this DatePickerDialog? Why don't you give me a date? Well, why don't we use today's date? And I'll say that in Java, working with dates has always kind of flustered me a bit, and so a lot of that carries over to Kotlin. But actually, we can do this in a fairly straightforward manner. First of all, let's just make a calendar object. Calendar.getInstance will give us a calendar object that's initialized to the current date. So from this, we can get a year, month, and day of month. Note the way that this calendar object works. We invoke a get function, and then we simply pass in a flag, which is typically an int, that tells us what we want to get from that calendar. So a little different from the typical getters and setters that you'd see in a Java or Kotlin object. But nonetheless, we now have a variable for year, month, and day of month. We can pass those in instead of the hard-coded 1, 2, 3 that I passed in earlier. I'd like to debug through this, and since this is a multi-step process, I'm going to go ahead and put a log statement in the onDateSet and snap a breakpoint there. Few more steps we need before we can debug, but this will at least get us set up. Let's go up towards the top in this fragment, and remember that button we added to our layout a little bit ago? Let's make a click handler for that. So in Kotlin, we simply reference the name of the button from the layout file. Remember here, BT and date planted. And here we have BT and date planted. Then .set onClickListener, and then we can do a lambda expression like so. Let's have this invoke a new function called showDatePicker. Haven't made that yet, so it's going to redline, so I can Alt-Enter, and I can say create function. Now in this function, we simply want to render that date dialog. Just a couple things we need to do here. First line, we are instantiating that inner class that we just made. Remember this guy? We were just there. Then the second line, we invoke show, which is going to make it visible. We pass up a fragment manager, and we have to give it some kind of label, so I just called it DatePicker. This is a good time to see what we've done so far, so I'm going to set a couple breakpoints. Also, I'm going to take away that inner modifier. Don't think we're going to need that. Let's take a look at what we get. So the application is rendered. Now here's the magic part. We press the button and we follow the bouncing ball. We see the onClickListener is fired. I press F7 and that goes to our show date picker. So I'm going to choose F9. And you see now it's going to put together this calendar, and we could do a quick mouse over and take a look at a few things. 2021 is the year, the month, 0. Remember when I said that dates are really tricky in Java or Kotlin? They start counting months with 0. So January, the month when I'm recording this video, it actually is month number 0 instead of month number 1. February is month number 1 instead of month number 2. So a big watch out there because that can get a little bit tricky. And then day of month 27. Sure enough, I'm filming this on January 27th of 2021. If you're watching this video many years in the future, I hope this doesn't sound like a really old video, but nonetheless, there we are. I'm going to go ahead and press F9, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to remove these breakpoints for next time so we can watch this go a little bit smoother. And here we are. You see the calendar has defaulted to Wednesday, January 27th of 2021. Let's say I go back to the previous day, Tuesday, January 26th. I choose OK. Look what happens when I choose OK. This onDateSet function gets called right now. I can look down at variables and confirm the year is 2021. The month is 0, January. Remember I picked day 26. I picked the previous day. While months start counting at 0 in Java and Kotlin, days of months start counting at 1. So just be careful of that. But nonetheless, you notice that this onDateSet function gets called when we successfully pick a date. I'll go ahead and choose F9. You see, we're back to our screen. I've taken off breakpoints now so we can watch this without breakpoints. Go a little bit faster this time. You see the calendar pops up and then the calendar goes away. But one thing that doesn't change, you notice that the text on the button doesn't yet change because we've not yet wired that up. And that's the next thing we're going to do. Those are our last 3 steps. Create an interface for the callback when the date is selected, and the current fragment or activity should implement this. I mentioned earlier we were going to skip this and come back to it. Now it's time to come back to it. Because we need that in this next step. Pass the date to the callback, and then update the button. Let's start by creating an interface. And you might remember what an interface is because we have one right here, and remember that's what gave us this function onDateSet. There are a couple of ways that we can create an interface. First, we can right-click on a package and say New, then Kotlin File Class, and then say Interface, and we can create it like so. That's a good idea if we have multiple classes outside of our fragment that need to implement this interface. But in our case, the interface is going to be local to the fragment, and it's only going to have one function. So I can create the interface right here in the same file as the fragment. One thing I want to point out, though, note that we're in main fragment. Take a look over there. Look closely at that icon. You see how it's a light blue circle with the letter C and then the Kotlin logo. Well, watch what happens when I declare this interface. Give it a name, open curly, close curly, and then save. You notice that this icon changes from that blue C to more like a file with a dog ear cut out of it, kind of like a gray file. That's indicating that this file contains more than just the class called main fragment. It contains either other classes or other interfaces as well. Now remember, this interface is going to have a function that's going to receive the date that the user selected, and we'll receive that in a year, month, day of month format. So we'll simply make a function, receive date, year int, month int, and finally day of month. Another step that we have is we need to make sure the class or the fragment that we're in implements this interface. Note that this interface is just kind of out here in no man's land right now. It's not inside of this fragment. It's in the same file, but it's not in the physical fragment's curlies. Let's go up to the fragment itself and let's add this interface to the fragment signature. To do that, we simply go to the class declaration line. We have main fragment, which is the name of the class, and then a colon and diary fragment, which means that main fragment is extending from diary fragment. After that, we'll add a comma and then say date selected. Notice that as soon as I do that, main fragment gets a red line. And why is that? Well, let's Alt-Enter and implement members. The reason why it does that is as soon as I have added this date selected interface to the signature, main fragment is under contract or under obligation to implement all of the functions that I have created in date selected. So implement members says, oh, okay, I see that there are some functions here that I need to provide an implementation for. So I click this, and it says I need to provide an implementation for receive date. I choose that, and finally, this is the function that will be invoked when a user picks a date. With so many similar names here, it's kind of handy to put a bit of javadoc or kdoc at the top so we remember which function is which, because you see receive date here, you also see it in the interface down below. Now we do have enough information now to update that date planted text. Something like this would work, but with a footnote. If you live in America and you've traveled outside of the United States, you probably quickly found out that this month, day of month, year format is something that's unique to the United States and I believe Mexico as well. So we want to be a bit more respectful of internationalization. And for that, we essentially need to reconstitute a calendar object. And then we can set the day of month, month, and year on this new calendar object. The advantage of putting this back into a calendar object is that we can format it. We use the simple date format, and in this case we provided a pattern. Lowercase d is the day, uppercase M is the month, uppercase Y is the year. This is something that I tend to use because it makes sense to people from many different countries. You could use a localized date, but I kind of like this format. Now, why is that? It goes in kind of a granular order from day to month to year, but more importantly, with 3 M's instead of 2 M's, it won't show a number for the month, but instead it will show a 3-letter abbreviation for the month. So 27 Jan 2021. In that case, there's no ambiguity of what the 27 means. That's more important if you have something like November 10th of 2021. If you had 10/11 2021, would that be right? Or 11/10 2021? Well, if you had 10-NOV-2021, it would be very apparent what it is, and you would also know what the November is. It'd be fast to read. So just a couple more things that we need to do then. We say viewFormatter.format and then calendar time, and we'll save that to a variable. And then finally, we can pass that formatted date here into the set text. So we've created the interface for the callback. We have implemented the interface in our current fragment. We are updating the button with the date. We're missing one more step, which is in our DatePickerFragment, we need to pass the date to the callback. Just a couple more lines of code, and then we'll take a look. In the DatePickerFragment class, let's update the constructor signature to accept a variable of that interface type that we created, the interface date selected. So we'll say date selected. And now we can do something logical on the onDateSet callback that we get when the user picks a date. We say date selected. Then we invoke the function receiveDate, and that's going to take a year and a month and a day of month. So it just happens to be the same order as this onDateSet, the year, month, day of month. It doesn't have to be. We just have to remember to take the values that we're receiving here and pass them in here. Okay, deep breath. One more thing we need to do. I've changed this constructor signature, so I have to change where I'm constructing an object of this DatePickerFragment. We've been working primarily in this main fragment class this entire time, but I will confess it is a large class and it's easy to get lost. The good news is it's easy to find out where we are constructing this DatePickerFragment because guess what? We now have an error there, so it shows up red on the right-hand margin. So I click on that and it says, oh, wait a minute, no value passed for date selected. Oh my gosh, well, what am I going to pass for date selected? It has to be an object of type date selected. Well, guess what? As long as we have a class that implements the interface date selected, we can pass that in to satisfy that variable. So, moral of the story, all we need to do here is pass in this. So at this point, I'm going to set a whole slew of breakpoints because I know we have a lot to look at, and then we'll take a look at this in the debugger. Let's press the calendar button, and first of all, the showDatePicker function is invoked, and remember that this is invoked from that button click handler. So I'll simply choose F9, and the next thing is we're in this inner class DatePickerFragment. Remember, that's one of the first things that we created. So we start by assuming the current date, and we create our calendar object out of that, and then we initialize the DatePickerDialog to that date. I'll go ahead and pick a time in the past. We'll say Friday, January 15th, and then I choose OK. As soon as I choose OK, it returns back to this onDateSet function. Remember that that's provided to us by this DatePickerDialog onDateSetListener interface. And then that in turn is going to call what? It's going to call the callback function that we created in this very same class just a moment ago, the one called receiveDate. So when I press F9 from here, I anticipate it's going to pick back up on line 288, just a few lines below. And sure enough, there it is. And we see here what we're doing is we're creating a new calendar object and we're populating it with the values that have been passed into us. And that is the year 2021, month 0, because remember January is 0 in the language of Java and Kotlin, and then day of month 15, because remember I went back a little bit and I picked the 15th. But now the important part, it's going to format that. And let's take a look at what the formatted date looks like. 15-Jan-2021, and then it is going to update the button with that date. And sure enough, 15 Jan 2021. Now, I've turned off breakpoints so we can do that again just a little bit faster. We'll pick, say, March 4th of 2021, and I choose OK. And you see there again, it updates to March 4th, 2021. Now, another step we could do is we'll need to take this date and assign it to the object under the covers that we're saving. But we have the date now. We know we've received it in receiveDate. So what you do with it beyond that is anything that you want to do with it. At this point, we've met our objectives. We've added a calendar to an Android layout with DateDialog, and we've done it in a way where we still keep that user interface nice and concise without putting an entire calendar widget in there, but the user can clearly see the date that's there, and the user can think, oh, okay, I need to pick this if I want to change it to another date, and then we bring up the dialog, then we choose OK, and then the user interface is updated with that new date. So it's a nice compromise between having a full calendar view where we're not asking the user to type in numbers and dashes, and we can still see the date was picked, and we can see the date clearly regardless of how we're used to seeing dates, day, month, year, month, day, year, so on and so forth. So as always, I hope this video has been helpful, and I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you.